you're talking to a neighbor or a friend, most of your conversations probably surround, hey, how's the weather? The football game this past Sunday, man, that was a great game. Or how are the kids doing? I'm doing good. How are you doing? That's often what we call small talk. It really has no substance to it. It's just kind of filler for feeling obligated, like we have to say something to the person standing in front of us. But there's no real substance to it. Now, I think there's some value in small talk. I don't dismiss it. I think it's important to our normal interactions with people. But if we're wanting to be more evangelistic in this coming year at the Dripping Springs Church of Christ, which is what we have committed to do with our 2020 vision, getting 20 new disciples in the year 2020, then we're going to have to learn how to have spiritual conversations with people. We're going to have to learn how to have more substantive conversations with people. And unfortunately, for some of us, that's going to require us to get out of our comfort zone. We need to pray for boldness, as we've been talking about. We need to be more bold. We need to try and be more intentional in our conversations with people. But how do you go about creating a spiritual conversation? Is it just, hey, the Cowboys did great on Sunday. By the way, you're under the condemnation of God. It's not like that. In fact, part of having spiritual conversations is learning how to build bridges, learning how to have some connective tissue in what you're already discussing and bringing it into a more sanctified light, bringing it into a more spiritual, having a more spiritual tenor about the conversation. So real quickly, here's four ways that we can have spiritual conversations with our friends and with our neighbors. Number one, use something that the preacher, that's me here at the Dripping Springs Church of Christ, use something that the preacher discussed in his sermon recently, or maybe something that you discussed in Bible class recently, as a means of engaging someone in a spiritual conversation. Now, usually it's connected to something that they just said to you. Maybe it has something to do with politics and the upcoming election. And you might say, we were just talking about in our Revelation class, we're going through Revelation right now. We were just talking about our Revelation class, how as Christians, even though nations rise and fall and leaders rise and fall, we really believe that God's in control, and ultimately He's going to be the king who reigns forever and ever. Something along those lines, using something that was said previously. Maybe, we just talked about the compassion of Christ this past Sunday here at Dripping Springs. Maybe something comes up about that where someone's discussing how someone was hurtful towards them. He might say, that's something that we were just talking about here at worship at the church, how compassionate Jesus was and how difficult it is for us to be compassionate. Use that as a means of engaging in spiritual dialogue so that can get them to thinking about spiritual things. Number two, use the Bible. Use the Bible. Maybe they're discussing something and you say, that reminds me of a scripture. It reminds me, maybe they're saying, the best made plans are often fail, or man, we made plans to do this, but it didn't work out. And you could say something, that reminds me of a scripture. Proverbs 19 and verse 21 says that many are the plans in the mind of a man, but it's the purpose of the Lord that will stand. That reminds me of that scripture. I don't know if you've ever read that or not. Use scripture. Now, this requires you to have certain scriptures memorized. It requires you to know the Bible pretty well, or at least kind of have a vague understanding of some of these scriptures. And or you can say something as, as a Christian, this is what I believe about this. They might be discussing some issue and you say, well, listen, as a Christian, I'm trying to follow the Bible, and this is what Jesus has to say about it. This is what the Bible has to say about it. Some people are going to give you the cold shoulder once you tell them you're a Christian, or once they see how convicted you are about being a Christian, but they're never going to know that you're a Christian unless you tell them you're a Christian. And so you need to do that. Use the Bible. So number one, use the preacher or worship as a means of engaging in spiritual conversations. Number two, use the scripture that applies to what they're saying. Number three, ask a question. Ask them a question about something in a conversation. Number one, say, hey, are you a believer? Are you a Christian? Now I get that not everyone who says they're a believer or a Christian are a New Testament Christian. That's a whole nother discussion. But it allows you to know, do they have common core beliefs that are similar to yours? And if so, you can say, well, as a believer, what do you think about this? What do you think about homosexual marriage? What do you think about worship? What do you think about any number of things? And then use that as common ground to say, well, hey, maybe we can get together and discuss this a little bit more later. If they're not a believer, if they have no belief in God, no religious affiliation, or they have a religious affiliation that's not centered on Christ, you can say something along the lines, well, how do you view that then? As an unbeliever, what's your perspective on that? I'd be interested to hear, because I need to know what you're thinking about it. So ask them questions along those lines. And then number 4, use your experience. If they're going through a difficult time in their life, especially, that's sometimes the best time to engage in spiritual conversations with someone. And you can say, listen, we went through something similar. I can't relate completely to your experience, but my wife and I, my family and I went through something similar, and the Lord helped me through that. He was my strength. My church family, they surrounded me with love. They helped me in so many ways. And then number 5, here's another way to engage in spiritual conversations. If you can, if it's appropriate, the context is appropriate, pray with that person. If they're needing you to pray with them, pray with them. Pray about the situation. Pray about a decision they're trying to make. That gets the conversation going and towards a spiritual direction. So those are 5 quick ways that you can engage in spiritual conversations, and I hope that you can implement them into the coming week. You're going to have to be bold. You're going to have to get out of your comfort zone, but I don't think it's going to be quite as awkward as you think it will be. And even if it is awkward, that's okay, because we need to talk about more serious things. Eternity is in the balance. People need more than small talk. Small talk's not insignificant, but we need big talk. We need big, bold talk in order to get people thinking about spiritual matters and things that really, really matter. And we're trying to move people in that direction. So there's 5 quick ways that you can engage in spiritual conversations.